Howdy y'all, welcome back. Thank you for being here. Today, with the first snow of the season, having just landed in Illinois, I thought there was no time like the present to share with you a rather obscure history revolving around the former capital city of this mysterious Midwestern landscape. Today, to the untrained mind, the first city that often comes to mind when discussing Illinois is Chicago, which is not the capital of Illinois, but it is the largest city. Springfield, Illinois actually claims the title of capital city, which it was awarded in 1839. However, Springfield is actually the third capital of Illinois, and we are going to dive into the history of the previous two. But first, listen to these throwaway facts in the narrative regarding Springfield. If you're familiar with my other research regarding the pre-Civil War United States, this will be even more eye-opening for you. According to the mainstream narrative, Springfield was originally founded around the year 1818 as a fur trading hub known as Calhoun, named for the Senator of South Carolina, John Calhoun. In 1820, John Kelly built the first permanent residence here on top of a large mound which overlooked the main creek through Springfield, which became known as the town branch. The Kelly cabin, as it was known, situated on top of the mound, was replaced just a few years later with the first county courthouse, built using some of the stones of the original property. It makes you wonder about the true nature of the landscape of Springfield, as we are told by 1821 it was considered to have some of the most fertile soil and largest trade opportunities in all of the Midwest. What exactly facilitated the events that occurred before, after, and during the Civil War? If you've watched my video on the alleged Paysor enterprise of the southern United States, this next tidbit is quite revealing. Springfield, then known as Calhoun, was settled first by Southerners from Kentucky, Virginia, and the Carolinas, who quickly built out the town. However, by 1832, Senator Calhoun was ostracized from society, and so the residents of Calhoun renamed the city Springfield. We're told that name was chosen by the wife of John Kelly, the original settler of Springfield, who founded the cabin on the mound, which eventually then became the site for the county courthouse. The creek which Kelly had named the town branch was apparently also known as the Spring Creek, and thus Kelly's wife chose the name Springfield. Rather convoluted, no? Part of me believes some sort of community or settlement existed here previous to European arrival, as illustrated by the mound, but I digress. The story of how Springfield became the capital of Illinois is equally as difficult to imagine and full of plausible deniability. Abraham Lincoln was said to have arrived to Springfield randomly in 1831 after he set out on his own, just about a decade after Springfield was founded. However, at this time, Abraham Lincoln chose not to stay. Instead, we are told Abraham ventured further into the wilderness, settling in the village of New Salem, which was founded only 2 years earlier, in 1829. From New Salem, Lincoln worked as the town boatman, the owner of the general store, the postmaster, the official surveyor, the rail splitter. He was a leading soldier of the Black Hawk War, and he was elected to the Illinois General Assembly. All of this was done from a tiny village which had only been founded 2 years or so before his arrival there. Lincoln controlled the boat travel to the town. He owned the store that sold all the goods to keep the people afloat. He was in control of all the mail of the town as he was postmaster. He essentially decided the history of the landscape as surveyor, thinking about the mounds and the earthworks, and finally he also controlled major aspects of the railroad. Does all of that really add up? If you think that it does, then listen to this. In 1837, Lincoln left New Salem to settle Springfield, and we're told by 1840, less than 3 years later, New Salem was abandoned. So all of those things that Lincoln established or controlled in New Salem, every single aspect of the town, it appears, collapsed when he left, seemingly indicating that Lincoln, quite literally, had vastly more power than the current narrative gives him credit for. And the question becomes, how? If we address theories regarding possible alternate origins for Lincoln's birth and upbringing, and we consider him a possible inherited leader, as in part of a system that was already in place in America that was controlled by what we refer to today as indigenous people. But in this theory, these groups appeared to be part of a much larger, intermingled conglomerate of trade and commerce which dominated America and then was inherited by the European settlers. If Lincoln was the head of one of these trade families, much like a merchant tribal leader, it would explain how he so easily transformed every city or town he visited, as this theory would indicate much of the towns and the cities may have already existed there in some capacity. Either way, the real plausible deniability is that, as we're told, New Salem was abandoned and a ghost town from 1840 until Lincoln passed away in 1865, although at that time, something miraculous happened. We're told archaeologists went through the ruins of New Salem, collecting documents about Lincoln, and this is where a vast majority of the information about his life actually comes from. Again, read between the lines, and what do you see? A chance to rewrite the narrative or fabricate a new one entirely. The village of New Salem remained relatively small and unoccupied until 1921, when the government of the United States opened a state park on the exact site of Lincoln's pioneer village. To further convolute things and to cover all the original tracks, the government rebuilt the original Lincoln version of New Salem around 1933 on the exact site of the original, essentially renovating all the history in the process. Now, by 1837, we're told Lincoln was one of the leaders of all of Illinois and was already poised for the White House. This is when Lincoln moved from New Salem to Springfield, where he lived exclusively until he became president. As the leader of the state militia of Illinois, Lincoln was also active during the Potawatomi Trail of Death in 1838, the forced removal of indigenous groups to new lands in what is today Kansas. The next tidbit is probably my favorite line in all of this narrative regarding Springfield. We're told that Lincoln and his, quote, business associates in Springfield were known colloquially as the Long Nine for their combined height of over 54 feet tall. Some contemporary estimates of that time put the combined height of the 9 men around 60 feet tall, which would average out to be 6.666 repeating for each man. Symbolism is always their downfall. Further, there is a museum dedicated to the Long Nine, and it was founded in, of all places, Athens, Illinois. Historically, earthworks and mounds, like those that were found throughout Illinois and the rest of the Midwest, as well as throughout much of the South, have almost always been associated with the mound builder culture. From roughly the founding of America, possibly earlier, through the mid-1900s, we have repeated reports of earthworks and mounds being excavated and inside being found the remains of rather large and sophisticatedly dressed individuals. Reports varied from heights of 6 feet all the way up to 10 feet tall or more. And as outlandish as these reports sound nowadays, it was common belief that mounds contained a species of man that once ruled over America. These mound discoveries in America were so radical that by the mid-1800s, a museum was founded to help aid in the excavation and, quote, preservation of these sites and their contents. This museum became known as the Smithsonian. You can't really read an article about indigenous mound excavations from the year 1850 onward without also hearing mention of the Smithsonian and how they oversaw the process. What makes this history truly ugly is that the Smithsonian confiscated upwards of thousands of indigenous skeletons during the years of mound excavations. And yet, just like so many other instances of plausible deniability, when questions arose of mounds between the two world wars, public curiosity again began to peak. This is around the time when the Smithsonian publicly announced that, while they had conducted thousands of excavations, all the skeletons of giants they had determined were actually elaborate hoaxes or buried big game animals, and none of them were humans. For this reason, the Smithsonian concluded that it no longer needed to preserve these remains from inside the mounds, and most of what was found in the mounds from the 1800s was destroyed. They didn't even try to hide it. They quite literally said, "There's nothing to see here," and completely rewrote the narrative, claiming that almost none of the mounds across America, hundreds upon hundreds of them, ever contained any sort of human anomalies. Yet just as the Smithsonian began its operations in the 1800s, literally at the exact same time, Lincoln was also rising to power. It's as if these two things went hand in hand, and the relation may come in the fact that Lincoln himself admitted that not only did the mounds contain the bones of gigantic human beings, but he also appears to admit that these beings ruled and built America, and Lincoln seems to imply a direct knowledge of how this was done. I'll leave a copy of Lincoln's speech in the video here, but could this information begin to paint the picture that Lincoln may have possibly been part of the so-called Old World regime that once existed in America? Could Lincoln's bloodline have been the same as the mound builders? And could all these groups have had relation to a unified sort of society that flourished before the European destruction of that history? Springfield remains the capital of Illinois, with almost all the effort for the city being named capital put forth by Lincoln. Of note here, there are a handful of things that stand out in the photographs when we're looking at the oldest images of Springfield. This is the capital of all of Illinois, and it was the capital since 1839, meaning you would think when the advent of photography finally did reach this landscape, we would have a cornucopia of photographs of all of the architecture that should be arising in this landscape, especially under the guise or the guidance of Abraham Lincoln. Yet, the photographs really do not begin until the early 1900s. I was only able to find a handful, maybe a dozen to maybe up to 20 photographs from the 1800s. One in particular really stood out to me because it was a postcard that included old, quote, old photographs of Springfield. Now, the postcard itself was from the late 1800s, meaning the photographs in the postcard should be from possibly the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. They were some of the only photographs that show the immense architecture that existed in Springfield before and around the time of Abraham Lincoln. So I'm going to zoom in, and they are not very clear, but we will be able to see just how immense this architecture was and just how much a lot of it doesn't appear to fit the timeline or the narrative that we've been given. Also, really important here, with all of the information that we've covered, the burial of Abraham Lincoln and the tomb of Abraham Lincoln are something that really stand out to me. We do have a memorial, a monument of sorts that was created for Abraham Lincoln on top of where he was buried in Springfield. However, originally, in the photographs from 1865, we can see very clearly that Abraham Lincoln was buried in some sort of burial mound, in something that looks almost exact to what we have read about and seen described as indigenous burial mounds, except for this burial mound that is attributed to Abraham Lincoln, we have a very well-built masonry, almost Roman-looking entrance. Yet just a few years after this burial mound was created, we then have a massive monument that was created on top of this mound, and then we have Abraham Lincoln being moved from within the mound to on top of the mound. And I found that to also be very revealing. I can't exactly pinpoint what is going on here, but there's something below the surface, literally, and there's something below the surface of the narrative itself. So look at these photographs. I'll try to point out any more anomalies that stand out to me. But another aspect, again, you will see this in some of the images, but we have a photograph that is alleged to be Abraham Lincoln standing outside of his home in Springfield. Now, knowing that Abraham Lincoln was well over 6 feet tall, we see him outside the entrance to his home, and the doorway to his home is twice as tall as he is, meaning either this is not Abraham Lincoln in the photograph, or this is some of the most massive architecture that we can imagine. Imagine the Grand World's Fair in Chicago in 1893 under the context of inheriting a system or inheriting a society and then presenting it to the rest of the world as something new. It's beginning to seem that the old world society that we can never really put our finger on once flourished in America, and here, directly below the surface, we can find evidence which supports a vast restructuring of the narrative which appeared to have begun with President Lincoln. Yet, even before Lincoln and before Springfield, the capital of the landscape of Illinois was shrouded in mystery and rooted in evidence of a vastly superior previous culture. So stay tuned for part 2, where we will dive into and discuss Kaskaskia, the lost and first capital of Illinois.